really believe that this idea of giving back, giving to society, contributing to society in whatever form is inherent in being African. So, in South Africa, we talk about, for example, Ubuntu, but that's about a way of life. And for this show, this is what we're engaging with. This is what we're talking with. We're exploring the idea of philanthropy. And so I'm chatting to Noxolo Hlongwane, who is the head of philanthropy for Nedbank Private Wealth, as well as Kerryn Krige, who's senior program manager at Network for Social Entrepreneurs at the Gordon Institute of Business Science. So how would you define philanthropy?
Kojo, if we look at the term philanthropy and its origins, it is derived from the Greek word philanthropia, which is love thy neighbor. So in essence, it is about a lifestyle of how we live and extend help to each other and assistance to each other.
So how does that something like that, love thy neighbor, then become about kind of high net worth individuals? Because the minute we talk about philanthropy, often our thinking goes there.
It is a bit unfortunate that we have adopted philanthropy or have come to appraise a particular type of philanthropy, which is very narrow. And that's been adopted from the West, really, where it is about that top-down approach, where it is the ultra-wealthy that are giving to the less fortunate. Whereas I think in our context, in Africa and in South Africa, it is a lot broader than that. There is the horizontal philanthropy where low-income communities continue to assist each other on a daily basis and have been doing so for many decades.
I mean, it's like as an African, the way we live and how our societies are structured, you talk of Ubuntu, you talk of Harambe, but I consider it a universal African thing where part of how our families are structured and how we live our lives is about loving thy neighbor and helping thy neighbor. I'd love to hear your thoughts just in general do you think that we're using the right language in terms of calling it or defining it as philanthropy, Kerryn?
So I head up a unit in social entrepreneurship, which is a term that very few people understand or know.
Yeah.
And so I'm not particularly hung up on terms. I think what is really important here is the concept of how do we support our social development, how do we support each other as people and as citizens. And I think there is culturally in all of us, especially when you look across different faiths, different cultures, there's this inherent process of this inherent nature and capacity to give, which is so important in terms of supporting our societies. What I think we're starting to look at, and this is very much the discussion around social entrepreneurship, is how do we actually expand that giving so that we can make our social development more sustainable. Our social enterprises don't take away from charity or away from benevolence or away from philanthropy or any of the terms that kind of surround the verb giving, but it really does look at how do you start making it
because
sustainable.
by its nature, social entrepreneurship is doing business, but built in the fabric of how you do business is still contributing to from a social perspective.
And so it's inherently not great for us because we sit there going, you can't do charity and make a profit at the same time, which is what social entrepreneurship is asking you to do. But when we look at the spectrum in South Africa of not-for-profit companies and for-profit companies, the for-profit companies are responsible for economic value generation and the not-for-profit companies for social value generation. And we can't keep relying on benevolence, on this act of charity to fund our social development. We see everything around us. Our news bulletins at the moment are just riddled with stories about how we have to connect our worlds. And all social entrepreneurship does is it opens up this middle of the spectrum to different forms of generating social and economic value, rather than relying on opposite ends of that spectrum. And philanthropy has such an important role to play in that whole process.
Because essentially, what it's doing, it's filling that gap that exists between the not-for-profit and the profit, because there's this entire universe down the middle, which we've been expecting, say, the goodness of people's heart or philanthropy, or however we want to term it, to fill in what is actually a really big gap in the market.
It is an exceptionally big gap, Kojo. And I think there are definitely shared values between philanthropy and social enterprise. And I think at the heart of it all is about addressing social injustices and social ills and coming up with sustainable solutions to address those social causes and social issues. So there are definitely shared values, but social enterprise definitely looks at a more sustainable manner in which we address these.
I mean, I find we do get caught up on kind of the jargon and the words, but if you look at something like CSI, corporate social investment, which I think at its heart is good intentioned, but the way it's been manifest. I mean, I used to work, in magazine, for example, and I always found it fascinating when an organization sends you a press release to go, we have done something good, or we've donated this money. Here's a press release. Can you talk about it? Would you say that we have this inherent, even giving back? When we have conversations, people always go, so do you give back? Like it's a medal that you must wave. It's a flag you must wave, or a pin that you have to go, I'm a good human being because I give back. How does corporate social investment fit within this entire discussion?
CSI is corporate philanthropy. And I think just in terms of individuals using it or businesses using it from a PR perspective, in our line of work, we find that a lot of philanthropists prefer to remain anonymous. They prefer to remain under the radar, and it is because they do it for altruistic reasons, not because they're looking to get any exposure out of it. But there is a case for individuals coming out, like Jill and Mr. Gray, who came out last, and Ellen Gray, to say they're actually going to be donating their majority shareholding at Ellen Gray into a foundation, because I think that goes a long way in encouraging other individuals to follow suit, and inspiring other individuals to do the same, and just to motivate and keep that culture of giving back going and keeping it alive. So I think in a similar manner, communities have an expectation of the organizations that operate within their communities. Yes. So it is important for organizations to actually be open in terms of what they do to assist the communities in which they operate in. But I suppose it's just how we do that and how we manage those PR exercises.
I think it always gets tricky when it starts getting linked into this world of public relations, and exactly what Nox is saying, that when you look at the genuine philanthropy, it is not done for exposure or for marketing. And when I was writing the book, The Disruptors, what was really interesting for me was this interrogation of this concept of benevolence and what it actually means, because that act of giving actually perpetuates an inequality. So by giving to you, Kojo, as an example, I walk away with this great sense of my goodwill, my humanity, yes, and you walk away with, what I've given you, with very little choice in that transaction. And so, this is really my train of thought, was that benevolence creates I'm the have, you're the have-not, I'm the privileged, you're the less privileged. When we rely on our social development to be funded by benevolence, which is our classic charity models, yes, the question we need to ask ourselves is, are we inadvertently perpetuating that inequality? And I think that comes through in the example that you've just used, is that when companies are giving to meet a mandate of CSI, or because it's expected of them and there's a marketing benefit from it, that's perpetuating an inequality.
Absolutely.
That is not one that we want to create. Corporates have a wonderful role to play in our societies, and there's a natural social benefit to any enterprise. We need to equalize these relationships. I think that's really important.
I remember many years ago, probably actually 10 years ago, traveling in the UK and sitting at a friend's house and having a cup of tea, and they put the carton of milk, and on the back they said, for every carton of milk, I think they contribute X amount to buy a cow for a villager in Kenya. And I just thought, first of all, do they need the cow? Secondly, if you're going to give them a cow, now they have to feed the cow in addition to everything else. Yeah. We'll often use the word sustainability. Like, is it a sustainable thing to give? And when I attended the launch of the Giving Report, I remember as a Professor Fowler talking about this idea of gifting as opposed to giving. Because giving feels very much like I give you something, I must get something in return. And look, Noxolo, you guys had him at your launch, having an understanding of his thinking, his approach. Somebody could ask, well, you've done this entire report called the Giving Report. Meanwhile, you have somebody who says, well, you should have called it the Gifting Report. What was the thinking behind? Look, I have an understanding of it, but I'd like to get the thinking behind why you'd have, voices like that within the space.
I think we're going through a very exciting transition in philanthropy currently, not just in South Africa, Kojo, but across the continent. I think we are in a space where we are really reclaiming the space for ourselves, and we are taking the lead in it. We've predominantly been dominated by international foundations and dominated by terminology and practices and standards that weren't ours.
Yeah.
So I think we are in that redefining phase where we are now starting to own the space. And with redefining, we are now broadening the term philanthropy, broadening the giving, to incorporate the cultural aspects that have previously not been appreciated in the Western definitions of philanthropy. And I think that's very exciting and very important, because it really will be all-encompassing and all-embracing for ourselves as Africans.
And I think it's important to add on there that we know so little about the funding of our social change, that a report like this really just gives us a ray of light in what is something that is often very instinctive, or that we know. We know we're a nation of givers, but we don't ever often have the facts to back that up. And because of that, actually, I believe that our social development, our funding of charities and non-profit organizations is hampered because we don't have the evidence. The insights from this report are really remarkable in what they tell us how high net worth individuals, how they engage with our society, and the rationale behind why they give.
And you chatted to 400 high net worth individuals for the report?
Yes, for the purposes of the study, Kojo, we define high net worth individuals as individuals that earn a minimum of 1.5 million per annum or have 5 million investable assets, and that excludes their primary home. And it's a national study that we interview individuals across the country, not limited to our clients only, just really trying to understand what individuals give to high net worth individuals, what motivates them to give, what sectors do they support. And I think that type of information and those insights, as Kerryn has mentioned, is invaluable in us trying to better understand the sector of philanthropy, of giving, what are the flows, what are the motivations, etc. So this is our contribution as a business to strengthening and growing the sector in South Africa.
So I don't know if this is a controversial question, but was something that struck me when looking through the report as well as when I was at the event. But the 77% of the givers are white, and it was also found that a lot of people kind of give through their personal networks. So if 77% are white, wouldn't their personal networks, by implication, be kind of down certain spaces? Access to certain spaces, whether it's charities, religious organizations, etc., which then could imply that there's a limit on the spaces. Let me rephrase. Not necessarily the spaces that truly need that assistance from these individuals are actually getting it because they fall outside of their personal networks, and they fall outside of the spaces that these individuals engage with.
If we just look at the profile of the respondents of the survey, Kojo, you're quite right. 77%, almost 80% over the past 3 reports that we've been doing, spanning a 5-year period, are white individuals. And I think that really talks to the legacy of our country and the history of where we come from. So in a country of a population of about 52, 53 million, we estimate the population of high net worth individuals to be at only 105,000 individuals. So I think that really just highlights the disparities and the inequality that we're talking about when we talk about inequality. So within that 105,000, almost 80% are white, which is not surprising if you look at where we come from.
Yes, absolutely.
Having said that, just to highlight also that our report was only focused on high net worth individuals. But I must say that there is a lot of other giving that goes on outside of that high net worth individuals. As we can see, the pool is so limited of high net worth individuals. But there is a bigger pool of individuals that continue to give. But within that, the 9 out of 10 that do give, they give to good causes, and they continue to do so. And that has been consistent over the past three reports over the past 5 years that we've been conducting this type of research. And networks and peer referrals continues to come out strongly. And I think because individual giving is driven by personal values, personal motivations. So individuals do rely on that, those shared values, those alignment of values. So naturally, you will rely and defer to people in your particular tribe, whether it be religious beliefs or whatever sort of underlying value and underpinning value. And I must say, there are values that cut across race. For example, individuals that have been affected by a terminal illness in the family. So naturally, those families will want to give back to those causes.
Yes,
and that cuts across race. So those people will generally gravitate towards the same causes. It doesn't matter what walk of life they come from. So I think the peer network, there is that economic sort of level where individuals of the same sort of economic standing, but I think it does cut beyond that.
And it's also interesting because we are living in a time where we look to our peers a lot more in everything. I think if you look at kind of the digital world, we have greater faith in, if I've interacted with the two of you recommending, for example, a restaurant to me, and then the restaurant going and saying, hey, look, we have great food. So in a way, in its own way, it's actually reflecting, I think, how the society itself is
developing. There's a trust
that is
inherent in that.
And where's most of the money going? I mean, I saw that, I think religious, what was interesting is that religious organization and religious foundation is a strong element of it.
So a lot of the support by high net worth individuals goes to community and social development causes. And those would be organizations such as organizations that look after the aged, orphans and vulnerable individuals. And that has been consistent over the past 5 years. And I think also just to reinforce that, because it is all about personal values and that emotional connection. So we do find that individuals connect with these causes a lot more, in contrast to corporates. Corporates support education the most, and because for them it's aligning with the strategies of the business, creating future markets. So it's all very strategic at that level, whereas with individuals it's a lot more personal. It's connecting personal values, connecting emotion to it. So they do support your social and community development causes, and religious beliefs continues to attract a lot of support from high net worth individuals, and continues to be a strong motivator. It was slightly down from 37% in the previous report to 34%, but it is still more than a third of individuals that are motivated by religious beliefs. And I think that's a value that once again cuts across denomination. It's not specific to a particular denomination, but it is a value that cuts across.
Kerryn, you are engaging with the kind of the evolution and a rethinking of, like you'll talk about, for example, benevolence or social entrepreneurship and its role within society. And, disruption is one of kind of our key words, and it's being spread across society in every aspect. Do you have any kind of knowledge of spaces that are actually, in essence, disrupting this space, in terms of opportunities for people to contribute to different spaces and how they're doing it?
It's a really nice question, and I might draw on Nox's experience here again, because I think the impact investing space is very much disrupting our typical traditional concepts of how we give or gift. In terms of actually blending these commercial models of accessing finance for charities and not-for-profit organizations, and opening up that spectrum to them. So we talking about access to debt, patient capital, and for financiers to shift their thinking from pure profit returns to actual social, environmental, and or high impact plus profit returns. I think we're seeing it's almost like these two worlds are colliding, and that's why I really do love that visual of the spectrum, because we need to really catalyze social and economic change at the same time. And so it's lovely to see it happening, not just in the conceptual areas around what is charity, what is a social enterprise, but actually in that very powerful world of philanthropy, funding and financing of social and environmental change.
How does trust play a role in this? I mean, for example, for example, especially now, the country, especially like the last year, there's been a lot of upheaval, and if you look at Fees Must Fall, and I remember kind of the first time around, and these kids are getting arrested or they're going on marches and they say, we need water, we need pro bono lawyers, or we need help with X, Y, Z. And you just using social media, they're putting up accounts. And to be honest, I contribute where it's like, they need water, I got $100, I'll just do a transfer into that account. And I found it interesting because I didn't question where it was going. Whereas traditionally I would go, well, who's getting this money? How do I know they're not going to spend it, et cetera, et cetera. So it really felt like there's this blurring of this idea of trust, or we're redefining how trust works.
If I can jump in, I also think it's also what we respond to in terms of what the cause is. And I think right now there's such a groundswell movement due to a massive lack of trust in our system. So when you look at the big theories around society and why we have civil society, you've got state, you've got business, and you've got civil society as these three sectors. And in the perfect democracy, the circles intersect and there's crossover. And that glue is trust. You trust your government to create an enabling environment for you. You trust the relationship that you have with business to create and provide you a service that you need. And if you don't need it, you won't pay for it. And civil society, in a way, kind of sweeps up what the other two sectors can't do. Which in itself is a problem because it creates a schizophrenic relationship for civil society to be both social justice and social service delivery. And I think in there sits some of the deep-rooted issues that we're dealing with. But in South Africa, I often see these circles as pulling apart because there's a lack of trust in our system. And because of that, I think to answer your question in quite a conceptual way is I believe that trust is everything, but you trust the cause. You don't really mind how that 100 Rand or whatever it is being spent because you know that the cause you're supporting resonates with you. And I think we go through cycles of that where we really see and respond to our country situation. And that means we're connected. And I think that is good. But I would argue that trust is at the real heart of a lot of our news headlines at the moment.
Tied to this trust thing, and I'd like to kind of shift to, for me, it's kind of how we harness what we have, and how do we start to shift things collectively and cover all the gaps. So instead of looking at one thing being the magic wand, because it often feels like we're looking for the one magic wand that's going to solve what are essentially extremely complex challenges that have developed over an extended period of time. And it's quite ironic that as human beings, we're like that. So, our challenges evolve over a long period of time, but when we're trying to fix them, we try to find that one thing that's going to fix it overnight. But one of the things that I have always wondered about and I've questioned, and I remember reading a story about the American Red Cross. I don't know how accurate it is, but with the earthquakes in Haiti in 2010, where they were said to have received $500 million in donations, and they built 6 houses. Now I wasn't there, so I try to take everything with a pinch of salt, but they said they provided housing for 130,000 people. Now, providing housing versus building houses, I'm a writer, so semantics is important for me in the use of language. But I often find that if you look at things like aid, it's always funneled through these massive organizations. And yet every day I interact with small organizations that don't need 1 million, need 10,000. That don't need 10 million, need 100,000. And there's a school that I went to where I asked the chairperson of the board, I said to her, what if I gave you 1 million rands tomorrow? And she said, this place would be transformed. And, she said it with so much conviction. So looking at the bigger organizations that exist, the bigger organizations that are out there, do you feel that there's still a space for those? In terms of all these very big NGOs and NPOs that we have, around the country and around the continent and around the world, or what are your thoughts on shifting and trying to harness and pull together the smaller ones?
I think in this space, collaboration and partnerships are everything, Kojo, and they continue to be such an important sort of factor in terms of getting the impact that we're looking for. And I think there's a strong case for all of us to work together, and that crosses sectors. So non-profit organizations working in partnership with government, individuals, private philanthropy working in partnership with corporates, in partnership with the smaller community-based organizations. I think in my space currently, in the private philanthropy space, we are looking at how does private philanthropy work strategically with government? How does private philanthropy work strategically with other partners? Because we appreciate that private philanthropy is potentially more flexible and more agile than some of the larger institutions, more agile than government. So there are potentially areas that we can influence as private philanthropy, and then government can then pick up and sustain. So I think we need to start thinking more collaboratively as players in the space, and there are very remote areas that large non-profit organizations are not interested in reaching. So those community-based organizations that are informal, that don't run fancy financials, that are just run by the community with very small budgets, those are the organizations that are critical in those spaces, that are filling such a massive gap and such a needed and meeting such a needed service in those spaces. So it's how do we get bigger organizations to partner with those small community-based organizations. The bigger organizations are always able to attract a lot more funding. How do we make sure that that filters down to the smaller community-based organizations? Because I think the spectrum is so wide, and there's room for everyone.
Yes.
But there's definitely a case for us working together more collaboratively as players in the sector.
I'd like to pick up on Nox's point, because there's also research that I did a few years back into what makes our civil society organizations successful. And essentially we don't really know. And one of the big findings was it's not actually the amount of money that an organization has, because the top 10 organizations ranged from income of R1 million to 40-50 million rand a year. But what really makes them successful is a degree of unrestricted income coming into the organization, which gives them an independence from this grant-based system, so that they can take risks, so that they can play essentially, and have more choice in terms of how they respond to the causes or that they represent. And I think often when we hear that the civil society sector is in constraints and it is in dire straits, which it is, it's in a very tricky situation, it's often translated into a rand sum amount. And that's not actually the right way to view it. We should be looking at the type of income coming into that organization and the independence it creates. So in response to your question, I'd say the more types of income that we can create for organizations and more funding streams, the better it is for them.
What about from when we go beyond money, when we go to things like skill? So I mean, I've done some stuff in the arts, in particular with kind of BASA, and what's interesting is with some of the organizations where they're sending in mentors to help different organizations with very specific skills that they require to be able to build relatively sustainable organizations. So I mean, how much are we seeing that, and how important do you feel that is?
From the findings of our study, Kojo, we found that volunteerism was on the rise, as well as non-cash giving. So that would be giving of essential items to non-profit organizations and essential items to individuals. So that is definitely on the rise, which is encouraging, because I think it also just demonstrates and reinforces that it's not just about giving money. But also more interesting is that volunteerism was on the rise. We're finding more and more high net worth individuals that are skilled professionals, extending their time to non-profit organizations, pro bono. And I think these are services, if you have access to legal services, accounting services, and so forth as an organization that you don't have to pay for. It goes a long way in building the capacity of that organization. So I think it is about us moving beyond just cash giving. There is space for cash, but I think also there are a lot more added services that we can then extend to non-profit organizations and to the sector that are valuable and that they are in dire need of.
I think it's interesting when we talk about, or when we look at something like social entrepreneurship, because social entrepreneurs, we hope, are operating with this understanding that it's about these two worlds and bringing these two worlds together. And a lot of times I find in smaller communities, some of the challenges that they face are more that mental shift. And therefore, somebody who's been able to identify a business opportunity and structure it in such a way that it has a social imperative too, can bring a lot to whether it's organizations, individuals, and communities.
So at Gibbs, I have been talking quite a bit about this because I actually believe our social entrepreneurs are super entrepreneurs. And as we see the economies globally contract, I think we're going to be looking to what it is they do and how they do it a lot more, because these are folk who can set up businesses with a social mission in parts of the world or in communities which business doesn't even see. It's not even on their radar because they don't connect the dots to opportunity. What social entrepreneurship does is it's this great equalizer. You were talking about trust earlier, and I think trust is that great equalizer where if I sell you a service that you don't want, you're not going to buy it, and my social enterprise is going to fall away. That's what profit does when it tackles that word benevolence. It creates an equality in the relationship between me and you. So as an example, in South Africa, when we look at our statistics, we all get very bogged down by education and the quality of education. But we see such a rise in great social enterprises that offer and focus on high quality schooling at a very low cost. I mean, that's a very good example of how the social entrepreneur thinks in terms of what is my social impact, but how do I generate an income from it through low-cost school fees? So I'm not reliant on a benevolent base of income.
Exactly, yes.
What that does, though, when you start operating that kind of business model in communities or places where big business just, as I say, doesn't see, you really start understanding how to operate in constraint and how to create diversity in how we view opportunity. And that for me is exciting because it opens up a whole new spectrum of how we see and engage with our world. So my opportunity is not just in how do I make money. My opportunity is how do I impact this continent that I'm in. And that's exciting.
I'd like to thank both of you very much because I think that's a great note to end on, because it's about kind of leaving a legacy that has an impact. And it's very easy to get caught up in words like legacy, but it really is about, I sincerely believe that, if each of us approached life where, the world was better for our having been in our little patch of this earth, if each one of us did that, I think collectively we could progress much further. And I'm hoping that conversations like this will start to spark for each one of us, whether it's people listening to this, ourselves having this conversation, and I know the two of you are involved in the space, so you have these conversations regularly, but I think it's important for us to constantly have those conversations, because then we start to find ourselves and a space for ourselves within the the greater thinking and the greater society. So thank you very much.